So imagine you are standing at the front of this massive cavernous hall in Kyoto, Japan. It's November, and you're looking out at an audience of like 300 delegates.
Oh, wow. That is a serious crowd.
Right. And it's this highly prestigious international poetry conference. So you've been flown in all the way from Europe specifically to speak about haiku in Swedish.
Which is already a pretty niche topic.
Exactly. I mean, you've got your notes ready, you know the centuries of history, and you're prepared to deliver this dense academic presentation. But as you step up to the microphone, there's this strange murmur rippling through the crowd.
Oh, no. That's the speaker's worst nightmare.
Yeah, you realize nobody in that room actually wants to hear your planned lecture. Instead, these very traditional delegates are eagerly waving their hands, desperately asking you to decode the work of one specific Swedish psychologist who recently won the Nobel Prize in Literature.
They only want to talk about Tomas Tranströmer.
They only want to talk about Tranströmer,
Yes.
nothing else.
I mean, it perfectly captures the sudden collision of two entirely distinct literary traditions, right? Because for a
Yep.
few, specialized academics in that room, Tranströmer was a familiar name.
Sure, the experts knew him.
But for the vast majority of those Japanese delegates, this Scandinavian poet had just crashed into their cultural consciousness completely out of the blue. He brings his Nobel Prize with him and basically sparks this fierce, immediate debate about the very future of their oldest art form.
Which is just wild to think about.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what our mission is for today's deep dive. We're going to unpack how a Swedish poet's lifelong evolution of the haiku, along with his incredibly distinct visual language, managed to bridge this seemingly uncrossable gap between Northern Europe and Japan.
It really is a massive gap, culturally, linguistically, geographically.
Totally. And the Swedish Academy actually kind of laid the groundwork for this when they awarded him the Nobel. They described his entire body of work as moving toward an increasingly smaller format and an increasingly greater degree of concentration.
Yeah, but that concentration, it didn't just happen overnight. The timeline here is actually super crucial to understand.
Right. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to write short poems.
Exactly. Tranströmer was dissecting the mechanics of haiku all the way back in 1959. He stumbled across the very first Swedish translations of the form's grandmasters, Bashu, Buson, Isa, Shiki.
Translated by Jan Vintilescu.
Yes, Vintilescu. And the sheer economy of those words clearly rewired his approach to writing. I mean, he immediately began adopting the structure himself.
But the setting is what gets me. He certainly wasn't writing from, like, the serene vantage point of a bamboo forest or a peaceful temple.
Not at all.
He was working full-time as a psychologist at a youth correction center. It's this incredibly tense, chaotic environment, yet he was quietly publishing a small booklet called Prison.
Yeah, prison.
And it contained 9 of these tiny haiku snapshots from his daily life there.
The environmental contrast there is just what makes those early poems so striking. You have a psychologist navigating the volatile, often really bleak reality of institutionalized teenagers.
Right, which has to be so draining.
Immensely draining.
Right.
But he is choosing to process that trauma through, honestly, the most delicate, highly disciplined poetic structure on earth. He is forcing chaos into a rigid 17-syllable container.
There is a specific image from that prison booklet that perfectly illustrates how he contained that chaos. He describes an escapee from the youth center who has finally been, chased down and caught by the
A
authorities.
super intense moment.
Exactly. The guards search the runaway, but instead of finding a weapon or contraband or something, they find his pockets are completely overflowing with golden chanterelle mushrooms.
It's just brilliant. You have the grim, authoritative reality of the capture suddenly interrupted by this bright, almost fairy tale treasure plucked straight from the wild floor of the Swedish forest.
It totally changes the scene.
It does. It proves that even in his 20s, Tranströmer understood the exact engine that makes the haiku work. It's the element of profound surprise, usually delivered in that crucial third line, which forces the reader to just completely reevaluate everything they just read.
Right, so decades after writing about runaway teenagers, he is suddenly being heralded as a visionary by modern Japanese haiku poets. But here is the fundamental friction in that relationship.
Yeah, the rule breaking.
Yeah, because to understand why Tranströmer made such waves in Kyoto, you have to understand the sacred rule of traditional haiku that he just completely, unapologetically shattered.
And it's a big rule. Traditional haiku operates on a strict ban against metaphors.
A total ban.
Right. The philosophy is that a haiku must be a direct, objective observation of nature. You present the image exactly as it exists in reality without comparing it to anything else.
No, this is like that allowed.
Exactly. Yet Kiro Oda, the Japanese publisher who took the massive risk of printing Tranströmer's haiku in Japanese, he did so specifically because of his rebellious visual language.
Wait, really? Because of the rule breaking?
Yeah. Oda encountered Aiko Duke's translations and was just entranced by the very metaphors that the traditionalists completely despised.
Okay, I have to be honest. I'm kind of struggling to see Oda's angle here, because if a traditional haiku is supposed to be a pure, unfiltered snapshot of a moment in nature, isn't adding a metaphor kind of like trying to watch a breathtaking sunset, but someone is aggressively tapping your shoulder, pointing at a painting of a sunset?
That's a really interesting way to put it.
Right. Like, doesn't it feel like slapping a heavy artificial Instagram filter over a beautiful raw photograph? It just forces your brain to look at two different things at once instead of experiencing the raw reality right in front of you.
Well, the old school of Japanese poetry argues precisely that point. They view a metaphor as an intellectual trick, something that diverts the reader's attention away from the primary subject and just dilutes the emotional impact.
Exactly. So how does Oda defend it?
Oda's defense of Tranströmer centers on the mechanics of how a metaphor functions when it's deployed correctly. Oda argues a metaphor isn't a distraction. It is a resonance chamber.
A resonance chamber.
Yeah, it provides extra energy. So instead of pulling you away from the sunset, a brilliant metaphor gives you a completely new sensory vocabulary to feel the heat and the massive scale of that sunset even more intensely.
Oh, I see. Which I guess feeds directly into a much larger cultural debate happening in Japan right now over the stagnation of poetry.
Precisely.
Because if an art form refuses to evolve, it eventually just turns into a museum piece. So Oda is looking at Tranströmer's modern rule-breaking metaphors and seeing, like, a necessary injection of vitality to keep the tradition alive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the really tragic part. That injection of highly concentrated metaphoric energy in Tranströmer's work, it wasn't merely a stylistic experiment to, shake up the literary establishment.
No, it wasn't a choice at all eventually.
Right. It eventually became literally the only way he could communicate with the outside world.
Yeah, because in 1990, Tranströmer suffered a devastating brain hemorrhage. The stroke paralyzed the entire right side of his body.
Which is horrific on its own.
It is. But far more punishing for a writer, it triggered severe aphasia. He essentially lost his ability to speak, and his brain could no longer navigate the complex architecture of long texts.
The expansive, sprawling poems he used to write were just suddenly impossible to construct.
So the physical constraint of his damaged brain actually forced him back into the structural constraint of the haiku.
It's incredible. Almost 4 decades after his initial experience in 1959, the form shifted from a literary curiosity to an absolute prosthetic necessity.
Wow, a prosthetic necessity.
Yeah, he leaned on it to speak. He released 11 haiku in his 1996 collection, The Sorrow Gondola, and then followed it up with an astonishing 45 haiku in 2004's The Great Enigma.
Because the format was the only container small enough for his restricted physical capacity, yet sturdy enough to hold the immense psychological weight of what he was experiencing.
Beautifully said.
There is actually a specific piece from this silent period that illustrates just how heavily he leaned on those controversial metaphors. Let me read how Robin Fulton translates it.
Please do.
Okay, it goes. The power lines stretched across the kingdom of frost north of all music.
I mean, it is just a breathtaking arrangement of words. The isolation in that final line is so palpable.
Right. Just think about the physical reality of those power lines stretching across a barren, frozen landscape. I mean, visually, they look exactly like the blank lines of musical sheet music strummed horizontally across the sky.
Yes, absolutely. The 5 lines of a musical staff.
Yeah, and both systems, the electrical grid and the musical staff, they're frameworks specifically built to transmit energy and vibration. But in this poem, the lines are completely frozen.
They're dead.
Yeah, they are strung across a kingdom of frost, totally empty, completely incapable of carrying a single note.
And Professor Tadashi Kondo, who was one of the leading organizers of that Kyoto conference we talked about, he interpreted the poem through a very similar lens.
What did he think?
Kondo suggested that the phrase "north of all music" is a hidden, agonizing metaphor for aphasia itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's the geographic coordinates of his own silence. The power lines are his vocal cords. The structural capacity for speech is still physically there in his throat, But the ability to transmit the music of language has been entirely frozen by the stroke.
That is just a devastating self-portrait. You can totally understand why one of the Japanese delegates reportedly sighed during the presentation and dismissed it as a purely gloomy picture.
Well, it definitely appears gloomy at first glance,
Yeah, okay.
but only until you run it through the philosophy of Japanese seasonal symbolism.
Okay, how does that change things?
In their haiku tradition, winter is the ultimate representation of nakedness. The colorful foliage and distracting warmth of the world have wilted away, right? Leaving only the stark architecture of reality.
So there's nowhere to hide.
Exactly. When applied to human psychology, winter means a person can no longer hide their true nature under pleasantries, small talk, or disguise. The stroke had basically stripped Tranströmer bare.
But the Japanese perspective on winter isn't inherently pessimistic, is it? Nakedness isn't the end of the cycle.
No, not at all.
It's more like a necessary clearing of the debris so that new creative strength can quietly gather beneath the frost. Like the silence of winter is actually gestating the spring.
Which introduces a completely fascinating paradox in his work. If his own physical voice remains frozen in that winter silence, who or what exactly is doing the speaking in these new, concentrated poems?
That's a great question. And the answer is he starts outsourcing his voice to the environment. He leans heavily into anthropomorphism, projecting human traits onto the natural world.
By giving nature agency.
Yeah. He titles one poem Sister Snail, granting this familial, almost monastic reverence to a literal mollusk. Or take this observation translated by Anatoly Kudryavitsky. A stag basks in the sun, flies flit and sow the shadow on the ground.
I love that one. An Osaka housewife attending the conference specifically highlighted that poem. She noted how it permanently altered how she observes light and movement.
Because of the verb sow.
Yes. The precision of the verb sow is extraordinary. You picture flies darting erratically back and forth around the resting stag, and their rapid movements are casting tiny, fleeting shadows that literally look like black thread.
Oh, stitching the animal's larger, heavy shadow directly to the earth.
Exactly.
I mean, I definitely understand the visual brilliance of the thread, but isn't anthropomorphism kind of a dangerous game in this context?
It is highly debated, yes.
Because traditional Japanese haiku treats the spiritual essence of nature as something profoundly sacred, right? Something totally separate from human triviality. Doesn't projecting human actions like a snail being a sister or flies sewing, doesn't that kind of drag the purity of nature down to our mundane human level?
It is a major point of contention. While grandmasters like Issa occasionally humanize the animals he loved, it's generally viewed with a lot of suspicion by purists. But Tranströmer avoids degrading nature because he completely reverses the hierarchy.
Reverses it how?
He doesn't pull the natural world down to human eye level. He actually elevates nature far above us.
Oh, right. He actually stated in interviews that trees are superior to humans.
Yes, he really believed that.
He reasoned that they outlive us, they physically dwarf us, and while they exist as solitary individuals, they are tethered to a much higher ancient collective. The forest. I mean, he famously described the forest as an entity that forgives everything but forgets nothing.
And that phrasing completely stunned the Japanese audience. Forgives everything but forgets nothing is an attribute traditionally reserved exclusively for God.
He's basically calling the forest God.
Exactly. Tranströmer is granting divine omniscience to a grouping of trees. And you really have to look at the physical geography of Japan to understand why that hit the delegates so incredibly hard.
Because of how divided the landscape is?
Yes. The Japanese landscape is sharply divided. The plains are intensely secular, dominated by concrete, neon, and hyperdense populations. But the forest-clad mountains overlooking those cities, those are untouched, sacred temple grounds.
Ah, so assigning a supreme divine status to the forest aligns perfectly with their own deepest geographical reverence.
It struck a massive chord.
But Tranströmer takes this ability to grant agency to the world around him and applies it not just to sacred forests, but to ordinary, completely inanimate objects, creating what is known as his opposites perspective.
This is one of my favorite concepts of his.
It's so cool. Take his poem about an everyday letterbox. It goes, "The letterbox shines quietly. What is written cannot be taken in back."
It's a very quiet observation, but the psychological shift happening beneath the surface is just massive.
It completely reframes the anatomy of regret. Think about dropping a physical letter in the mail or, in a more modern context, hitting send on a risky email or a late-night text message.
Oh, we've all been there, the instant panic.
Yes. The instant it leaves your outbox, you are flooded with regret. You experience that entire situation entirely from your own helpless, rueful perspective. You are just trapped in your own anxiety.
But Tranströmer rescues the reader from that anxiety by completely abandoning the human perspective. He writes the poem from the triumphant point of view of the letterbox itself.
Right, the object shines quietly.
Exactly. It has consumed your secret, it has won the exchange, and it absolutely refuses to give it back.
By forcing your brain into this opposites vision, where the desperate sender and the cold metal box swap places, he breaks you out of the prison of your own ego. I mean, next time you find yourself raging at a jammed printer or a locked door or sent email, try viewing the interaction from the triumphant, quietly shining perspective of the object.
It completely diffuses the emotional weight of your own frustration.
It really does.
And once you establish that objects and concepts have their own independent agency, it opens a dangerous, fascinating door in his poetry. Because if a letterbox can triumph over a human, then the boundary between the physical and the psychological begins to dissolve.
Leading to entirely surreal parallel worlds.
Precisely.
A prominent Japanese haiku editor at the Kyoto conference drew a comparison that sounds completely absurd for a Nobel laureate. He actually compared Tranströmer's sudden surreal leaps of logic to manga.
Manga. Yes, I remember that comparison.
It seems crazy, but you see it in lines like, "The memories see me." He isn't sitting in a chair nostalgically reviewing his past. The memories themselves are physical entities arriving from a parallel dimension to literally stare at him.
And the manga comparison is deeply insightful when you look at the societal pressures of Japan. Japanese daily life exists within a highly regulated, strictly choreographed physical and social world. The external expectations are just immense.
Very rigid rules.
Very rigid. And because that reality is so strict, there is a deep, agonizing cultural hunger for secret, surreal parallel spaces where the rules of physics and society just no longer apply.
And they consume that heavily in manga.
Right, they readily consume that surrealism in manga. But the editor admitted that contemporary poets rarely possess the courage to inject that level of bizarre, parallel world logic into the sacred traditional space of a haiku.
But, okay, this brings us to what I think is the ultimate paradox of his success in Japan.
Let's hear it.
If Tranströmer's poems are overflowing with his own intimate memories, his personal stroke-induced aphasia, and his own surreal dreamscapes, doesn't that violate the single most important rule of the form?
Ah, the ego.
Yeah. A classic haiku is famously described as being too small to allow room for the poet. The author is supposed to be like a piece of clear glass the reader looks through. Where is the absence of the ego in Tranströmer's work?
Well, that is the defining magic trick of his career. He mastered the mechanics of the disappearing ego, and he did it using the very constraints of the format itself. Tranströmer once remarked, "Fantastic to feel my poem growing while I shrink."
While I shrink. That's so powerful, because outside of Japan, the vast majority of Western poets treat haiku merely as short, free verse, completely ignoring the strict 17-syllable 5-7-5 structure.
Go completely.
But Tranströmer was an absolutist. He adhered strictly to the syllable count.
And the inherent risk of rigidly counting syllables is that the mathematics can sometimes overpower the art. But for Tranströmer, that strict numerical boundary acted as a creative jigsaw puzzle. And this is exactly how he forced his ego out of the frame.
Oh, so?
When you are restricted to exactly 17 syllables, you simply do not have the real estate for self-indulgence. There's just no room for phrases like, "I felt, I thought," or "I remembered."
Right, the mathematical constraint physically forces the inner monologue out of the poem.
Precisely. He gathers these deeply intimate, highly personal memory notes,
Yeah.
but as he forces them into the unforgiving 5-7-5 grid, the sheer friction of fitting the puzzle pieces together sands off all the personal edges.
Wow.
He refines the raw emotion until the I completely vanishes, leaving behind only the stark objective image. And as Professor Kondo pointed out, this arduous transition from the deeply personal to the universally impersonal, that is the foundational bedrock of Japanese artistic culture.
So Tranströmer utilized an ancient Japanese syllabic structure to build a bridge out of his own isolated, damaged mind. It is just a remarkable trajectory. I mean, we began with a young Swedish psychologist writing tiny, disciplined snapshots about youth offenders carrying wild mushrooms.
Seems like a lifetime ago in his story.
It does. We watched him endure the horrific tragedy of a stroke that froze his ability to speak, forcing him to rely entirely on those tiny snapshots just to communicate. And through that constraint, his daring visual metaphors, his surreal opposites vision, and his ability to completely erase his own ego, He ended up revitalizing the very birthplace of the poetic form he spent his life studying.
And when evaluating his legacy, Professor Kondo actually concluded that Tranströmer shares more spiritual DNA with the ancient Grandmaster Bashji than with any modern contemporary.
Really? More than anyone modern?
Yes, because Tranströmer famously refused to ever explain his own poems to critics or journalists.
Okay.
He constructed these incredibly complex puzzles, but he demanded that the reader take on the final burden of interpretation.
He trusted you to finish the emotional work.
He did. And that silence aligns flawlessly with the advice Basho gave to his disciples centuries ago. Bash said, "Study the masters, but do not seek to imitate them, rather. Seek what they sought."
That's beautiful.
Tranströmer's never tried to write a fake Japanese poem. He sought the same raw, objective energy that Bash sought, and he somehow managed to find it buried deep in the frozen Swedish winter.
Consider the profound irony that Tomas Tranströmer's most vibrant visual language and his deepest, most celebrated connection to a foreign culture halfway across the globe only fully blossomed after a devastating medical event stole his physical ability to speak.
It's incredible to think about.
It raises an incredible question for you to explore in your own daily life.
Yeah.
Perhaps true universality and genuine human connection aren't found in the sheer volume of words we have the power to broadcast, but rather in the quiet, restrictive silences we are occasionally forced to navigate. When you strip away all your unnecessary vocabulary and you find yourself standing alone in your own kingdom of frost, what is the single powerful image that remains?
It is a challenge that requires an entirely new way of looking at the world.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive to explore the mind of Tomas Tranströmer. Until next time, keep seeking what the masters sought.